We now come to the second opposition day motion on increase in employers' national insurance contributions. Mel Stride to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Growth, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the leitmotif of the party opposite. They chanted on about it during the run-up to the last general election. And in their manifesto, under the heading Kickstart Economic Growth, they said they would secure the highest sustained growth in the G7. They also said, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I know that you like a good joke, but I would ask you to contain yourself, because they said, and I quote, that they would bring forward or forge a new partnership with business to boost growth everywhere. A new partnership with business. Given what has happened, these are fantastical statements in their manifesto. Reading their manifesto, Madam Deputy Speaker, was something like stepping through the looking glass. It had something of Lewis Carroll about it. This lot was less the Prime Minister and the Chancellor as the walrus and the carpenter, cruelly leading businesses to their demise. And for all the fantasy in the manifesto, Madam Deputy Speaker, they might just as well have spoken of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. Because what happened to growth? The OBR tell us that this budget will lead to less growth across the forecast period than was the case back in the spring under the last government. I will give way momentarily. The ONS tells us in the third quarter GDP data that the economy grew by 0.1%. That is 1/7 of the growth that there was in the United States. And in the third month of that quarter, being September, growth was actually negative. That is the record of this government. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. And when he's talking about the OBR figures, of course, what he fails to mention is that his party misled the OBR to the extent that the OBR had to put in writing the failure. Isn't the truth, while he's talking about Lewis Carroll, the figures the OBR were working to were more inclined to have been received from the Mad Hatter?
Well, it's an amusing intervention, but thoroughly inaccurate, I'm afraid, because the OBR did indeed look into the suggestion that there was a black hole of £22 billion, and what did they conclude? They concluded, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the fiscal pressure in that year was less than half that amount. They readily accepted that had they had discussions about that at the time with Treasury officials, they may well have reduced that amount still further. And of course we know right across this House that it is not unusual for Treasuries to manage down in-year fiscal pressures as a matter of course. So it has been debunked. It is the dead parrot. It is pushing up the daisies. It is no more. What this government has done, and that point that the honourable gentleman raises, is indicative of what this government has done. It has talked down the UK economy. It has talked down the economy, and that in turn has seen business confidence slump in a way seldom seen in our history. PMI surveys falling down below the floor. We have seen also the Institute of Directors, their optimism tracker, scoring -60 in November. You would have to go back to April 2020 to find a lower score than that. And we know also, Madam Deputy Speaker, that when it comes to the budget, right at the centre of that, of course, is the biggest broken promise of all, the National Insurance Employers' increase. That is weighing on growth, Madam Deputy Speaker. And Madam Deputy Speaker, what of jobs? The manifesto, this fantastical manifesto, talks about job creation. Job creation mentioned several times, but they are destroying jobs, Madam Deputy Speaker, by breaking a manifesto commitment. It was there, in black and white, in their manifesto, that they would not raise national insurance. Don't take my word for the fact that they breached that manifesto. Take that of Paul Johnson of the IFS, who says precisely the same. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you very much for giving way. The Right Honourable Member refers to broken manifesto pledges. The 2019 Conservative manifesto said, in terms, we will not raise national insurance. Yet 3 years later, he and all of his colleagues voted to raise national insurance, not just employees, but on employers as well. Can he help us with that process of logic?
So I think the honourable gentleman might just be overlooking a little something called COVID that shrank the UK economy by over 10% overnight. What this government has done, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to take us right back to the 1970s when it comes to the jaw-dropping level of tax increases and spending splurges. And the impact on jobs is stark and it is clear. The OBR says 50,000 fewer jobs, 50,000 FTE fewer jobs as a result of the measures in this budget. Bloomberg put it at 130,000 jobs destroyed. The CBI, in a survey of its membership, says that 50% are reporting that they will be cutting employment as a consequence of this budget. Two-thirds saying they'll be rowing back on the recruitment plans that they previously had. And it is, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, not just the headline rate, it is also the threshold that is so pertinent and important here, bearing down, as we know, particularly on those sectors where wages are lower and those cohorts within the labour market who are earning the least because of the disproportionate impact that lowering a threshold has. Hospitality, leisure, retail, women, some of the youngest people in our country are now going to see their jobs taken away from them as a consequence of what this government is doing. And we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Labour Party has formed when it comes to youth unemployment. Under the last Labour government, youth unemployment increased by over 40%. Under the last Conservative government, it reduced by over 40%. And when it comes to inflation, Madam Deputy Speaker, they said in this fantastical document they would keep it as low as possible. They said the same of mortgages. And yet what has happened? This fiscal splurge, this £70 billion each year that they're now going to be spending, is meaning higher inflation in every single year of the forecast compared to the forecast back in the spring. And what is that doing to people's living standards? It is destroying them, and I will come to that momentarily. And part of the inflationary pressure, of course, is the national insurance increase itself, because whilst we know that about 80% of it, according to the OBR, will be transferred into lower employment rates and depressed wages, about 20% of it will go into higher prices. And what of living standards? This fantastical Lewis Carroll document said they would be making everybody, not just the few, better off. But the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Madam Deputy Speaker, hardly a right-wing think tank, says that by October 2029 the average family will be £770 worse off in real terms than they are today. I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I would think on this side of the House we will not take lectures on living standards from the party that left us with the worst squeeze on wages since Napoleon, the highest energy prices in the G7, as well as the highest inflation, because you left us with the worst insulated home and dependent upon natural gas, and that is why this party will invest in insulation to make us all better off in the long run.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm surprised that the honourable gentleman should raise the inheritance that his party has received from the party on my side of the House. We had the highest rate of growth in the G7. We had brought inflation, which he specifically mentioned, down from 11.1% in October 22, right down, bang on target of 2% at the time of the general election. We had near record level of employment. We had a near record low level of unemployment. We had real wages that have been increasing month after month for 13 or 14 months prior to the general election. That was not a bad inheritance. Somebody was seeking to... I'll take the honourable gentleman.
Chancellor for giving way, even if I can't quite believe what I'm hearing, boasting about the economic record of the previous government, particularly in the immediate run-up to the last election. I think anyone doing that should read the release from the Office for National Statistics out this week on the reweighted labour force survey, which shows that productivity in the year running up to the election fell by 0.9% in just 1 year. That is what economic failure looks like.
I'm afraid the honourable gentleman, no matter what points he may make, cannot get away from the fact that this government is bearing down on growth, pressing up on unemployment, bearing down on employment and bearing down on living standards. I'll give way momentarily. The OBR also says, it's a pleasure, trust me. The OBR also says that real household disposable income by 2029 will be 1.25% lower than it was back in the spring at the time of that forecast. And we know the impact that national insurance is going to have on wages. It will press them down and it will further diminish living standards. And I give way to my honourable.
Well, thank you, Shadow Chancellor. I just wanted to ask the Shadow Chancellor whether he remembered a time at the last general election campaign where any Labour MP stood on a manifesto that was fully costed, which would mean that economic growth was forecast down than the forecast under the last government. And maybe the member for Swansea West should remember the fact that Labour MPs stood on a manifesto that apparently was fully costed, but then we had different commitments. But we had a faster rate of growth under the last government that is projected under this government.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. The simple facts are that at the time of the general election, we had the fastest growing economy in the G7. A simple fact is that in the Labour Party manifesto, they state that they are going to deliver precisely that. And yet we have heard very little about that commitment in recent days and weeks. And I wonder why. But could of course I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Honourable friend, does he agree with me it's important to set the facts right? And it's important just to reflect on the fact that during our 14 years, despite the 08-09 financial crisis, despite the pandemic and the energy crisis, over 1 million jobs were created and 4 million people were in employment that weren't in employment when we took office.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Our record on employment and job creation, we were a job-creating machine since 2010. We were a job-creating machine, and the statistics that my honourable friend raises are quite right. But, Madam, I will momentarily, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, when it came to business, and this is a killer, this is worthy of a stand-up comedy routine. They said, and I quote, Labour will support business through a stable policy environment. And of course we know that all sorts of businesses, Madam Deputy Speaker, have been hit by this tax increase, including many of those who support directly our public services, our hospices, our GPs, our pharmacists. Marie Curie saying that they are about to get an additional tax bill of £3 million, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just think of the impact that that is going to have. And the question that many are now feverishly and in a very worried state asking is, will there be more to come? Is this government going to run out of road with the way it is approaching our economy and come back for more? Well, the Right Honourable Lady, the Chancellor, of course, said to the CBI very recently, and I quote, we will not be coming back with more borrowing or more taxes. And yet, when this assertion was put to the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's questions today by the Leader of the Opposition, we had no answer. When we put questions yesterday, I asked twice of the Chancellor exactly that question. We got no response. So those businesses do not currently know whether the Chancellor's assertion that there will be no more borrowing or no more taxes is true or false. I give way to the...
I'm very grateful to the...
Apologies. Was it a point of order or was it an intervention?
No, it was an intervention.
I apologise, I thought I heard you say point of order. Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Shadow Chancellor. It sounds like he's unconvinced of the shrill chants from the members opposite that they're going to fix the foundations of the economy. And with good reason he may be suspicious, because in October, when they'd scarcely been in office for 3 months, they had to borrow more than any other in-month borrowing in the United Kingdom since 1993, with the exception of 1 month during COVID. Does that look like fixing the foundations to the Shadow Chancellor?
Honourable gentleman, and I've heard the honourable gentleman intervene in various debates. I have to say I'm coming to the conclusion he's probably a rather sensible member of his party, because he is absolutely right. Far from creating solid... I didn't, nonetheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, I did not opine on how sensible his party was. I just said he was one of the most sensible people within it. I just wanted to make that quite clear. But could I say that it is very clear that this party is not going to be creating firm foundations for the economy. They're actually going to be creating a vulnerable economy, because there are risks going forward. There are risks around the central forecast, downside risks around growth and inflation and net migration and economic inactivity and energy prices and interest rates and so on and so forth. There are also risks around the spending envelope after the first couple of years, particularly for a profligate Labour government who may find that constraint unbearable. There are also external risks. We know that there will be a new government in the United States, and there is talk of tariffs. And it may be that there will be deficit financing of tax cuts that lead to interest rates rising around the world as bond yields increase, and that gets imported to our shores. All of these things mean that you need to have a good level of headroom against your fiscal targets. And yet on the stability target, it is quite possible that that headroom has already evaporated. Why? Because, to my earlier point, the government talked down the UK economy, and partly as a result is paying more to service the debt that this country carries. And I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way. My ears were piqued at his talk of deficit finance tax cuts. Does he agree with his now boss, the Leader of the Opposition, in saying that the Liz Truss mini-budget, the prime example of the thing he criticises, was the right package but just the wrong communication?
Well, if the honourable gentleman has a look at the history of that time, he will know I was the chair of the Treasury Select Committee at that precise time, and I had a great deal to say about the economic policies that were being pursued in the so-called mini-budget, and I will leave it at that. But, Madam, I'll give way to my... How could I not?
Extremely grateful to my right honourable friend, and he's giving a very powerful speech. I wonder if he's noticed, like me, and shares my feeling of pity for some of the, in some cases, distinguished new members of Parliament on the other side, who again and again want to talk about the past as we recovered from the pandemic, got through the energy crisis, but not a single one wants to defend this appalling NIC employers' increase, which will take $26 billion out of the economy and yet ultimately only provide about 10 or 11 billion in revenue to be used for public services. It's an extraordinarily misstep, is it not?
They are desperate. My right honourable friend is right. To avoid the present and run away from the future, and there is no surprise as to why that is the case. Madam Deputy, I wait now. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government supporting business is living in a world of fantasy. With the walrus and the carpenter, it was trusting oysters that were led to their early demise. With the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, it's businesses that were trusting. So as Lewis Carroll might have written, as the final verse, "O businesses," said the Chancellor, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd, because she'd finished off everyone. And that just leaves us, Madam Deputy Speaker, standing up for businesses in this country, for the working men and women in this country. We are the party that understands the difference between fantasy and reality. We are the party that knows that businesses need lower taxes, not higher taxes, less regulation, not more regulation, and needs to have a government that is on its side. And that is not the party opposite.
The question is, as on the order paper, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Chancellor made a number of interesting points in his speech today, and I just want to give him the courtesy of going through a number of them. He said that he talked about how this government is risking inflation when his government sent it spiralling to the highest level in a generation. He says that this party is talking down the economy when they crashed it. He said that they disagreed with the measures in this budget, and specifically for the debate today on national insurance contributions, but not one alternative option was laid in his speech to the House today. And I think the public have a right to know. What would his choices be? Would the party opposite want to increase income tax on workers or VAT in the shops? Or would they like to increase corporation tax again on business? Would they like to cut tens of billions of pounds from public services, or borrow more money every single day to pay the bills, or continue to make a black hole in the public finances? And he suggested that this party's transparency with the country about the £22 billion black hole that party left was not real, but they know they created it, Madam Deputy Speaker. And might I just say, the sooner that the party opposite says sorry to the country, the sooner the public might start listening to them once again. And can I just finish with a positive comment? Because the Shadow Chancellor said that his party was a job-creating machine. And I'm very grateful to them. I'm very grateful for the number of previous Conservative MPs they've released into the labour market, given how many vacancies that we have. Madam Deputy Speaker, in her budget statement on the 30th of October, the Chancellor set out the difficult decisions that the government had needed to take on welfare, spending and tax. Those decisions were not just difficult, but also necessary, given the fiscal irresponsibility and economic mismanagement from the party opposite over the last 14 years. And I welcome a debate on the choices, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm hearing from a sedentary position, choices, choices, choices. What are yours? You should set that out to this House. You should set, the party opposite should set them out to the public.
The Chief Secretary might like to reflect that when he says what are yours, he means what are mine. They are not my choices. Could he please be careful not to use you and yours?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To be very clear and to correct the record, the Conservative Party should tell the country what their choices are. And I am all ears, Madam Deputy Speaker, because this party inherited a mess. And we, as a responsible party of government, have needed to take measures to fix the public finances, to fund the National Health Service and other public services, and deliver economic stability. We have been determined to take these decisions whilst protecting working people, our manifesto commitment. And that is why the budget made no changes to income tax, the rate of VAT, or the amount of national insurance that working people will pay. As a result of our budget, people will not see a penny more tax in their pay slips. But keeping those promises, whilst getting the country back on track, meant tough decisions elsewhere in the tax system. Choices and decisions that we are willing to take. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Extremely grateful to the Chief Secretary, and I hope, perhaps with the assistance of the Minister behind him, he might be able to answer a question that other Treasury Ministers haven't been able to answer, and that is why the OBR made a correction on Table 3.2 in Chapter 3. Originally, they were suggesting that £5.5 billion will be provided for compensation to public sector employees and adult social care. That was then corrected to remove any reference to social care, and the number was cut by £800 million. Can he explain what made the OBR have to do that correction, and when was it decided that social care wasn't worth support?
Darren Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the right honourable gentleman in future might give me advance notice of specific references to documents so that I can refer to them. I can't tell him about Table 3.2 in the OBR document because it's not here, but we will of course get an answer to the right honourable gentleman. What he may wish to consider, Madam Deputy Speaker, is why, of course, the OBR said that had the party opposite been more transparent about their time in government, their forecast would have been materially different, something that the Shadow Chancellor was unable to answer in his interventions from colleagues around the House. That is why, at the budget, we took the decision to increase national insurance contributions for employers whilst increasing protections for small businesses and charities. The government increased the main rate of employer, secondary, class 1, national insurance contributions from 13.8% to 15%. We have decreased the secondary threshold for employers, the threshold above which employers begin to pay employer national insurance contributions on their employee salaries, from $9,100 to $5,000. At the same time, we have increased protection for small businesses by more than doubling the current employment allowance from £5,000 to £10,500, and I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Give thanks to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Regarding the impact of the national insurance hike on small businesses who form the backbone of our local economies as fixtures on our high streets across London and in my constituency of Sutton and Cheam, Worcester Park, North Cheam, and across the whole area. Will he join me and recognise that this weekend is Small Business Saturday? And does he agree that the government might take this opportunity to rethink the national insurance hike and the impact on small businesses who will be suffering this weekend and beyond?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have factored in small businesses into the design of our policy, both in terms of employer national insurance contributions, but also our commitment to permanent rates for business rates at a lower level than was given under the previous government, and other support for the high street as well. We're also expanding eligibility of the employment allowance by removing the £100,000 eligibility threshold to simplify and reform employer NICs so that all eligible employers can now benefit. Changes to the employment allowance mean that around 250,000 employers will see their national insurance contributions liability decrease, and over 1 million will pay the same or less than they did previously. Overall, that means that more than half of businesses with NICs liabilities will either see no change or will gain overall from this package, a design put in place specifically to protect the small businesses the Honourable Gentleman raises with me. And that means that 865,000 employers won't pay national insurance at all. This means that employers will be able to employ up to 4 full-time workers, for example, on the national living wage and pay no employer NICs. Employers will also continue to benefit from employer NICs reliefs, including for hiring workers aged under 21 and apprentices aged under 25. To support veterans, the government is extending the national insurance contributions relief for employers of qualifying veterans for 1 year to April 2026, and we have set aside funding to protect the spending power of the public sector, including the National Health Service, from the direct impact of these changes. Even after accounting for the impact of this change, the OBR expect level of real wages will rise by 3% between now and the end of the forecast period. But we recognise there will be impacts on employers. While many small businesses and charities will be protected through the employment allowance, others will, yes, have to contribute more. We also know there will be impacts beyond business, as the Office for Budget Responsibility has acknowledged. I give way to my honourable friend.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He and I both spent many years in opposition. We've been in many opposition day debates. And does he agree with me that when the opposition puts forward a motion like this that says the government shouldn't do this, but without any alternative suggestion as to what they actually should do, it is a sign of an opposition that hasn't actually worked out the answer to those questions? At some point in the future, I hope the opposition may be able to help the country and the government by having some policies. But does he agree with me, until they do, the government will just have to crack on as best they can on their own?
Chief Secretary.
I agree with my honourable friend, and I encourage honourable members opposite to put forward proposals. I'm all ears. I'm willing to listen to them. But as so far is the case, all we have is opposition and no policies. Maybe that will change in years in the future. We also know there will be impacts beyond business, as the Office of Budget Responsibility has acknowledged. This motion claims that the government has not set out any impact assessment of the policy change, but the government published a tax information and impact note on the 13th of November, which explained the government's assessment of the policy, including on businesses and the economy more widely. So this was a difficult choice, and it is not one we have taken lightly, but it is the right choice given the dire economic inheritance that this government faced upon taking office, and it is the right choice given the need to fix our broken public services. As the Chancellor set out in the budget, healthy businesses depend on a healthy NHS, and a strong economy depends on strong public finances. I'll give way.
Point about the NHS and about choices. Will the honourable gentleman not accept, though, that his choices, his government has chosen to clobber organisations and charities such as the Air Ambulance, the hospice movement, the very organisations that his government will need to help improve services for the general public? So again, as yesterday, will he consider an exemption?
Darren Jones.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for her intervention. As my Honourable friend, the Health Secretary, has made very clear, when this party came into government, the NHS was broken. Why? Because of the actions of her party over the last 14 years. That is why this government has to take decisions to get a grip of public finances and to get a grip of our public services. To draw a line under instability so that businesses can now plan for the future, and to ensure that the NHS will receive an extra £22.6 billion to deliver 40,000 extra elective appointments a week. That's why these changes are necessary. Vital new funding to create an NHS that is there when we need it, and achieve within our tough fiscal rules. Rules that will bring an end to borrowing for day-to-day spending, something that was completely out of control when the party opposite were in government. Madam Deputy Speaker, you might think that having called for higher NHS spending over the weekend, the opposition would recognise the need to take tough but necessary decisions on the public finances in order to pay for it. But it seems from the Honourable Member's statement that this is not the case. So perhaps they might take the opportunity today to explain how they will be raising the £25 billion that these changes provide, but which they will not support. How else do they intend to pay for the new appointments and better services that this funding offers? What tough decisions would they make to repair the public finances and put our economy on a sustainable footing? The double standards they have set out on this issue only goes to show why they are not trusted on the economy and why they've given up any pretence of fiscal responsibility. Madam Deputy Speaker, we recognise that the decision to increase employers' national insurance will have impacts. Although the changes to the employment allowance will help to protect small businesses and charities, other measures mean that larger businesses and organisations will have difficult decisions to take themselves. But as the Chancellor has set out, this was a once-in-a-generation budget. The difficult decisions we took meant we were able to wipe the slate clean from the previous government's economic and fiscal mismanagement. Public services will now need to live within their means on the budgets that we have set for them for the rest of this Parliament. The budget delivered economic stability and fiscal responsibility so that we can take the steps necessary to boost investment, fix our public services and grow the economy. That fiscal responsibility is only possible when you are willing to take tough decisions. The government will not shy away from those tough decisions, and we will do what is right to fix the foundations of our economy, despite the dire inheritance left by the party opposite. And the Shadow Chancellor said we were hiding in the past and not facing to the future. Might I just say to him, we are running to the future, dealing with the challenges and delivering for the British people.
Before I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, there will be a 5-minute time limit from the outset, obviously not including the Honourable Lady. Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 23rd of October, at Deputy Prime Minister's questions, I warned the Government that an increase in national insurance contribution changes would impact not only millions of small businesses, but especially social care providers. Here we are, that was a week before the budget, and here we are 6 weeks on from that exchange, and we're still talking about the impact of the national insurance contribution changes. The reason for that is that the unintended consequences are huge. Now, we all know that the Government has received a terrible inheritance from the Conservatives. The Conservatives flatlined our economy, they blew a hole in the public finances and left public services on their knees. In the wake of the Conservative Government, there is a litany of broken promises. They promised to recruit 6,000 GPs and didn't. They promised to fix social care for good and they didn't. And every single year since 2015, they failed to meet their 62-day cancer treatment target. So I have huge sympathy. I have huge sympathy for the fact that the Labour government needs to and wants to invest in our NHS and care. However, I am very concerned about the indiscriminate impact of the national insurance contribution changes. You've heard this before, come on. Not only do these changes undermine growth, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I'm concerned they will undermine the efforts to get the NHS and care back on their feet. Over the last 6 weeks, we have heard concerns, all of us have heard concerns, about the impact these changes will have on GPs, on dentists, on pharmacists, on social care providers, all organisations that are critical to getting the NHS and care services back on their feet. We've heard about the impact on the early years sector. I'm concerned that these changes will drive up costs of childcare when we should be driving down the costs to help parents get back to work. Over the last few weeks, I've raised examples from my own constituency about the impact these changes will have on citizens' advice, who give advice to some of the most vulnerable people, the impact on Hightown Housing Association, providing for social homes, on Quantum Care, a social care provider, Rennie Grove Hospice, the Beds and Hearts Medical Committee representing GPs, DJ's Play and Ye Oldie Fighting Cocks, the oldest pub in England. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all know in this House that small businesses are the engine of our economy, the backbone of our communities, and I will give way.
Grateful to her for giving way. I'm really glad to hear that Liberal Democrats support the extra money for the health service and special needs, education and social care. And I apologise for my impatience. I'm sure she's just about to get there. But can she tell us where it is that she would identify the £25 billion should come from, if not from this national insurance rise?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. No, I welcome that intervention. In the debate we had yesterday, during the passage of the bill, I addressed that question head-on, and I'll try and remember my notes, which are now sitting with Hansard. So the honourable gentleman will be aware that the OBR has said that that 26 billion is actually reduced to 10 billion when you factor in behavioural changes and the rebates to the NHS and care. So in terms of raising that £10 billion, we have said that we would reverse the tax cuts that the Conservatives gave to the big banks, raising £4 billion. You could raise a further £3 billion. You could raise a further £3 billion by increasing the remote gaming duty and the digital services bill as well. We had set out proposals in our manifesto to reform capital gains tax in a different way to the way the government had have done that. Our measures would have raised about £5 billion. So unlike the Conservatives, who did not set out the impact of their £10 to £20 billion cuts that would have been inevitable from their manifesto, we, by contrast, as a constructive opposition, have set out suggestions, and I urge honourable members on the Labour benches to take up our ideas, if not in this budget, then certainly in the next. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the issue of small businesses, we are approaching Small Business Saturday, when we'll all be in our constituencies, I hope, and I'm sure, talking to small business owners. We know that small businesses are the engine of our economy, they are the backbone of our communities, and in many cases they make our high streets what they are. But when it comes to health and care businesses, I am concerned that this measure takes with one hand and gives back with another, but with no guarantee that the money that will come back will actually cover the costs. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do urge the Government to rethink these changes to national insurance contributions, but if they don't, at the very least, to exclude health and care providers from these measures. Thank you.
Josh Simons.
Thank you. The economic arguments in this debate will be well covered by others, so I'd like to make a brief point about choices and political leadership, about having arguments rather than ducking them. For a decade, as low growth placed ever greater burden on the public finances, the members opposite fiddled and fudged, choosing stealth taxes like fiscal drag that they hoped nobody would notice. From 2010 to 2021, Conservative governments introduced 1,651 tax changes. They changed vehicle excise duty 258 times, alcohol duty 125 times. The last Parliament saw the largest set of tax rises since the Second World War, leaving the tax burden at a third of national income. When you are frightened of your own shadow, as well as your own divided backbenches, it's easier to fudge and fiddle than to face up to hard choices. The members opposite lacked the courage and the unity to tackle the great problems this nation face, but not us, not this government. When we see something fundamental that requires courage and leadership to address, we square up to it and we confront it. That's why we immediately undid the fiddles and the fudges, ending the freeze on income tax that's burdened working people in this country. Why we ended the hidden theft of money from working people and fixed the injustice of the mine workers' pension scheme, and why we boosted HMRC compliance, because there is no point in creating a tax behemoth that you cannot enforce. And it's why we made a big, clear choice to close the gaping hole in the public finances left by the members opposite. Britain's economy has run a tight labour market alongside stagnant productivity growth for decades. And in that context, national insurance rises are a sensible, balanced and transparent way to incentivise business investments that will boost productivity while filling the £22 billion black hole. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is what courage looks like. Squaring up to the challenges our country faces instead of running scared and leaving working people to pay the price. We have fronted up to set this great country back on a secure path. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the opposition wish to show the nation they are a responsible party ready to govern this great country, they must have the courage to tell us whether they would scrap this measure, and if not, which challenge that we face do they wish to ignore? Do they want to cut off the electrification of the Wigan-Bolton train line? Do they want to get rid of the experts working with the Wigan, Wrightington and Lee Trust in my constituency to bring down waiting lists? Or perhaps they want to cut back, once again, the neighbourhood police officers who we are getting back on our streets. Or perhaps they want to cut the £150 million investment in the Border Security Command. I don't think so.
Speaker, thank you, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member, the member for Makerfield. I rise to speak in favour on the amendment on the order paper in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do not rise in this House because I think that the Labour Party's budget is vindictive. But I do think that what we have seen in the national insurance rises today fundamentally is a proposal that runs right through the Labour Party's DNA. They drive down growth when that growth should be the #1 priority for public services. They tax the wealth creators and the small businesses. They borrow and make the economic situation worse, and it's always this party that has to pick up the pieces after they have targeted and made the poorest people in our society and the smallest businesses in our society suffer. And ultimately, that lack of growth that this party and every member over there has signed up to will mean that public services will actually suffer. Fewer jobs will be created and more businesses will close. And I gently say to the Minister that he challenged us repeatedly to outline what we would do instead of this measure to make sure that we could fund those public services. And I'll tell him a few things that we wouldn't do. We wouldn't put this national insurance... Well, I'll tell him in a minute, and he can intervene and elaborate, and I'll get an extra minute. But he will say... he asked me what we would do. I tell him what we would do. We would increase growth, which was outlined in the OBR. We would have growth, a higher growth than this government is proposing. We wouldn't be borrowing as much as him, and we also, what we wouldn't be doing is spending £9 billion on public sector pay rises for his trade union paymasters, funded from borrowing. That's the things that we wouldn't do. I'll give way.
Chief Secretary.
I'm grateful for the honourable for giving way. He tells the House that he would go for growth. How did that go when his party tried last time?
Well, I simply say, the Chief Secretary should know this because he supposedly wrote the budget that we voted on a couple of weeks ago. Growth forecasts under the last government were higher than the government that he is now leading, or in the Treasury that he's now leading. And I say to the government that business confidence is now at the lowest that it has been in years. And Hamble Valley, I'll give way very briefly.
The honourable member for giving way because he's raised this issue of business confidence, which I've heard a few times from the benches opposite, which leaves me pondering why, if businesses were so confident under the previous government, did we have the lowest private sector, lowest business investment in the entire G7? And the only country in the OECD that saw lower levels of private investment was Greece.
I know that the honourable gentleman likes to pride himself on being the oracle of economics when he led a think tank. But I do say to him that if he looks at the bare facts out there with business confidence is now lower under 5 months of Labour government than it ever was under 14 years of Conservative government. And I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the impacts that this measure will have on my constituency in Hamble Valley. 4,000 people, Madam Deputy Speaker, are employed in my constituency in the hospitality sector. And just last night, I had a business leader, a small business leader that owns 3 local venues in my constituency, that now is outlined to me that because of the measures that this government has brought forward, He is now going to have to find 5% of his total turnover extra in taxes that this government has put forward. And that leads to a number of options. It means he has to reduce, he can either reduce staff count, meaning higher unemployment in my constituency and higher unemployment nationally. He can close venues, which again means lower employment and the death of our town centres in every constituency, might I remind members. And it also means that he has to choose whether between not hiring staff, local staff, or stopping expansion, because now every extra person that he wants to take on because of this national insurance contribution rise will mean £800 extra on that business should they take an employee on. And I just want to... That is a choice that is facing businesses up and down the country. Lower growth, higher bureaucracy, higher taxes on the people that create jobs and wealth in every constituency of this country and actually drive the economy that we need to fund public services. But most damaging under this government's proposal is the catastrophic impact that it will have on charities across this country. And I defy any Labour MP to stand up in this chamber and say that they are willingly happy to bring in a measure that will mean that frontline services delivered through our charitable sector would be cut, and they're happy to vote for that. There are other options that they can take. They have chosen not to. I'm not giving way, because in that, well, I've got time. But if we look at the hospice sector, many members opposite will probably hope that the parachute leads were cut, but I jumped out of a plane for the hospice sector, Mountbatten Hospice in my constituency, raising £10,000. 70% of their income is charitable donations. 24% of their income is delivered by the National Health Service. Nowhere under what this minister is about to say when he stands up, or any other time that a minister has stood up in this House, have they outlined to the hospice sector or apologised to the hospice sector for the cuts in services that will have to be delivered because of this measure. Mountbatten will have to find £1 million extra in income just because of this measure, and that means that more hospital beds will be used from people not being able to access those hospice services, and ultimately the NHS being put in further crisis because of this short-term measure that this government's bringing through. I like the honourable gentleman, so I'll give way.
Thank him for giving way. I was looking at some research the other day that actually shows that parachute jumps end up costing the NHS more money because of the risk of injury than they raised for the charities concerned. So will he agree with me that rather than parachute jumps, what our NHS needs is the £22.6 billion investment that has been raised by this budget?
Of course, the last government gave the highest amount of investment into the National Health Service that it's ever seen. I happened to jump out of a plane because I was very keen to do so, because I'm a bit of a thrill seeker, but I'm wanting to raise money for a good charity. But what I would say to him is that this measure, if he votes for votes for his amendment or votes against this motion this evening, he is making sure that hospices across this country are not able to deliver the services that they want to deliver, making sure that homelessness charities that have said that 50 to 60 million pounds will be taken out of frontline services. That is the impact of this measure. Madam Deputy Speaker, charities across this country are going to suffer under this government's proposal. Hospitals are going to suffer under this government's proposal. Wealth creators are going to suffer under this proposal. And every time that a member goes through the division lobby tonight to vote against this motion to protect frontline services, their constituents will be watching. We shouldn't be surprised, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Labour Party in 5 months after taking office have gone back to type. They've reverted to type. Tax the most vulnerable. Tax small businesses. Borrow on the public purse. Poorer public services out there and lower growth going forward. I can't wait for their defeat at the next election and us fix their problem.
Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. After inheriting the ruins of 14 years of Conservative failure, this government has had to make tough decisions to balance the books. Yeah. And I'll keep it coming until you get the message. Until he gets the message. Very good. After 14 years of working people footing the bill, this government is choosing to spread the load in as fair a way as possible. In the spirit of building an economy driven by collaboration between productive workers and thriving businesses, a balance has to be struck.
So whilst we are asking employers to contribute more, this does of course come with protections for small businesses. Whilst employer national insurance contributions will increase by 1.2%, this government is choosing to protect the smallest businesses by increasing the employment allowance to £10,500 and expanding this to all eligible employers. So let's stop the politically expedient outrage and check the real-life impact. Changes to the employment allowance means that the OBR expects that 250,000 employers will gain from these changes, and an additional 820,000 will see no change. We have also committed to provide support for public sector employers for additional employer costs. This also means that, unlike the previous government, who gave us the highest tax burden since the Second World War, Labour are able to not ask for a penny more out of workers' pay packets. Whilst we must listen to those genuine concerns from businesses who, like the rest of society, are feeling the brunt of 14 years of Tory austerity and decline, I am in no doubt that these decisions are the right and necessary ones that will fix the foundations of our economy and unlock the funding to rebuild our public service. On that, yes, I will.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He was talking about fixing the foundations, and that was also a point made by the now absent member for Angus and Perthshire Glens earlier on in this debate. And today was the Scottish budget in the Scottish Parliament, when of course the Scottish Government had a record amount of funding to spend. And I just wanted to share with the House what was said about that budget by the Fraser of Allender Institute. They said it was a difficult...
Order! We simply can't have interventions of that length. There are only 9 members going to get in to speak this afternoon. The Honourable Lady is on the list, but people who choose to make long interventions might find themselves removed from it. Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say to my honourable friend, I totally agree that this government is supporting people across this whole country, including Scotland today, and I really hope the Scottish Government uses the money it has been given well. Yeah. Taking the motion back to the opposition who brought before this House today, were they also opposed to our country being left a £22 billion black hole by the last government? Yeah. Were they also opposed to the disastrous Liz Truss mini-trust budget, which included £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts that shocked the markets, crashed the pound and skyrocketed mortgage rates? Were they also opposed to the last government's spring budget, which included a myriad of damaging unfunded promises in an attempt to flash the cash to the public ahead of an election? If they now do oppose all of the above, then they must agree with me that we've got to restore economic stability by funding our pledges. Yep. That means finding money. And if it's not enough, if it's not through this, then are they going to tax working people, or are they going to make another black hole? We have to face down the reality of these choices for what they are. And it is overwhelmingly clear. The Shadow Cabinet, who were exiled into opposition this summer, have not learnt a single thing. They've made £6.7 billion in unfunded spending commitments in just 4 weeks. At least we can be grateful they aren't in the position to do more damage at the moment. And now I want to turn to what funds raised from this measure will actually do. Are the opposition opposed to investing an extra £25.6 billion to fix the foundations of our NHS, to cut waiting times with 40,000 extra elective appointments a week? One.
Joe Robertson.
I thank the honourable gentleman. He talks about the NHS. What does he say to Pharmacy UK, who report that the measures of his government will cost pharmacists £50 million, and that's even after taking into account the employment allowance? What does he have to say to them?
What I would say to all members of this House is that people have to see it in the round. They have to see these measures in a budget that will support all of our business in the long run.
Yeah.
Are the opposition now opposed to protecting the triple lock, increasing the carers allowance, freezing fuel duty, paying workers properly and supporting local councils? Are they opposed to boosting education funding by £6.7 billion to hire 6,500 extra teachers? Our children desperately need to secure their future. Because if they are not listening to the British public, who in my constituency of Stevenage and hundreds of other seats at the last election that voted for a change from the years of Conservative chaos, a change with Labour that will bring a decade of national renewal to fix our public services from the ground up. Businesses can only have the confidence to invest in the UK if we bring stability into the economy, put money into the pockets of their customers and develop thriving public services for their workforce that will, in turn, improve productivity for their businesses. This business confidence was demonstrated by the record-breaking £63 billion in investment secured for the UK economy at the International Investment Summit. Under Labour, Britain is open for business. So today, the Conservative opposition are asking us to pretend that we can grow our economy and rebuild our public services without saying how it would all be paid for. This Tory opposition, with its motion today, shows it has learnt nothing from 14 years of Tory fantasy economics, and it was the Shadow Chancellor who brought up fantasy economics. His party has delivered that for 14 years in government. But today, we have a Labour government. The country voted against fantasy economics in July, and today I will vote against that too.
Lisa Smart.
Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm going to talk in particular about two organisations in my Hazel Grove constituency who have contacted me on the subject we're debating this afternoon. Now, for context, we know that small businesses have had a very tough time for a number of years. They've been struggling with rising energy prices, with interest rates and input costs going up. They were absolutely hammered by the previous Conservative government, which broke its promise to reform business rates, trapped them under a mountain of red tape and made it much harder and more expensive to trade internationally. And making things harder for small businesses and their workers just isn't right. They're the lifeblood of our economy and exactly where we should be looking for the growth we all need. But when we're talking about small businesses, we are of course also talking about community pharmacies, about hospices and about GP practices, all of whom will be impacted by this tax rise. We on the Liberal Democrat benches are particularly worried, as you would imagine, about the impact of these tax rises on our health and social care sector. We're worried about what this means for social care providers, for the families who depend on them, and for the local councils who have to find the funding for many of them. Now, raising the employment allowance will shield only the very smallest, leaving thousands upon thousands of small organisations still negatively affected. And in his opening remarks, the Chief Secretary asked for ideas about where else he might find some tax revenue. And I'd really encourage him, and indeed members on all the government benches, to reread the 2024 Lib Dem manifesto, as I'm sure they've read it at least once. And as the Honourable Member for St Albans laid out from our front bench, they could reverse the tax cuts that the last government gave to the big banks. They could reform capital gains tax so that it's applied in a much fairer way, and they could charge the gambling giants more so that they pay their fair share. So, on to the two organisations in my constituency, Madam Deputy Speaker. A childcare company got in touch because, like many early years settings, they allocate 70% of their revenue to staff wages, and annual increases to national living wage combined with this increase in NICs will just make it impossible to pay for rent, staff improvement and training. This is just going to make the staffing crisis worse, and that is the exact opposite of what this government says it wants. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Would she agree that businesses like Sheppey's Cider Farm in Taunton Wellington constituency, to which I invite all members to come and enjoy a pint of cider, will be affected not just by national insurance rises, but by the change in business rates and the family farm tax as well?
Lisa Smart.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I sadly have not yet tried the wares of Sheppey's Cider Farm, but I would welcome the opportunity to visit and to try their wares and to support them, as we all need to do in the face of these changes impacting them all. The second organisation, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I want to raise in the chamber today is one of my GP practices. And they emailed, because of course they operate as a legal partnership, and they have done since the inception of the NHS, but as a GP practice, they lack the flexibility to absorb these increased costs. They can't raise prices, they can't do more than they're already doing and drive up activity levels. Because they're designated a public authority, but they're not exempt from this, they don't get an employment allowance exemption. So they're going to bear the absolute full cost of the impact of this. And they tell me this rise in national insurance and the lowering of the threshold is going to force reductions in clinical staffing, adversely impact patient care and increase waiting times. This is exactly the opposite of what the government says it wants. I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for making that point. It's very powerfully put. In my constituency, speaking to a local GP surgery, they're going to have to cut 7 members of staff. That's a GP, a nurse, a social prescriber and a pharmacist and a number of other ancillary services. That is going to affect not just her and my constituents, but every single constituency in the country, because every single GP practice will have the same problem.
Yeah, very good.
I thank the Honourable Member very much for his intervention. I completely agree with the point he's making. I think all members across this House want to see our NHS thrive. They want to see the healthcare and the social care, indeed, that our constituents deserve. And I urge the government to think again about its plans.
Would the right Honourable Friend give way?
I will give way to my Honourable Friend.
Victoria Collins.
I'd like to reiterate on that point. In Harpenden, Berkhamsted, we have the Elms Medical Practice, which has said we are dedicated to NHS. They want to serve people, but actually they're facing these difficulties. And it's actually asking the government to really rethink their choice on this national insurance, because it's about those who want to serve and our constituents who need it.
Mrs. Smart.
Yeah, I very much agree with my honourable friend on the point that she's making. I think all of us in this House will have had constituents and organisations contact us because they're really worried about the impact that these changes will have. I don't think the government intentionally set out to make life more difficult for GPs. I don't think the government intentionally set out with its budget to make life more difficult for pharmacies, for hospices, for dental practices. But I do think we need to speak up for our constituents who contact us to say that if the government wants to keep the cost of childcare from rising, if the government wants our constituents to be able to access a GP appointment in a timely manner, they need to think again about this rise, and I urge the government to do so.
Louise Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A former Conservative leader once said the famous phrase, "There is no magic money tree," a lesson, sadly, that side have yet to learn. Let's be clear about the economic situation that we are facing. In July, the tax burden was at a 70-year high when the Conservatives left office, and they left us with a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. This is their legacy, and they must live with it. Confidence in public services at an all-time low, the tax burden at an all-time high, and they couldn't even deliver on their promises in my constituency of North East Derbyshire. If they had chosen to invest the money needed into our NHS, then they would have seen the benefits. If they had invested the money into our schools, then they would have seen the benefits. And if they had funded our armed services to take on the challenges of tomorrow, again, we would all see the benefits. But instead, as I look at the primary care centre in Claycross, I see hard-working health staff let down by this former government. As I look at Killamarsh Junior Schools, again, I see hard-working staff and young children let down by this former government. And as I speak to my former army colleagues, I see no improvement in the situation there either, thanks to this former government. So we must now take action. It is our duty as a government to take the hard choices necessary. I believe that in the long run, this is a positive and necessary step for our UK economy, our public services and workforce. National insurance contributions are the backbone of funding for our essential services like healthcare and pensions, and it is what my voters chose. If we fail, yes, I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. The Vale of Glamorgan, and Wales in particular, is full of small and micro businesses. The ONS and OBR both told us now that most of small businesses and micro businesses will be better off or the same as before. Not only do the Vale's businesses get better public services, but a good tax setup too. Does my honourable friend agree this is a great budget and a great proposition for small businesses in the Vale?
I couldn't agree more, and I have heard from so many small business owners in North East Derbyshire who are so thankful for the changes that we are making to support them. So if if we fail to make these decisions today, we risk facing the prospect of cuts to crucial services or an increased burden on future generations, a burden that would fall on the most vulnerable in society. Rather than waiting for these issues to become... Yes, I will.
It's about cuts to vital services. Would you agree with me that no one would think less of the government if they were to take, I don't know, 3-4 billion out of the 22 for the NHS and ensure that social care, hospices, GP surgeries and the like don't lose out from this, so that we actually can have a holistic and positive input into the health service rather than the disjointed one which we're at risk of right now?
Jones. I thank the honourable member for his contribution. I'm sure that the health team will listen to all and any contributions and will make a decision as they will. Right, the Labour government that we have, that I support, on this side of the House, refuses to balance the books on the backs of the poor or on workers or people striving for a better life. Instead of austerity Mark II, I'm just going to make progress. I know there are the backbenchers who'd like to speak. Sorry. We choose to invest in our services, our children and the people who fight every day to keep us safe. These increases will strengthen our public services, promote economic stability and invest in the future of our workforce. This increase is an investment in our long-term prosperity and I fully support them.
Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The budget forced businesses to compromise on growth. That is the words of the CEO of the CBI. The OBR has said that the jobs tax will reduce wages by £7.5 billion and increase inflation. Both the OBR and the CBI say it will result in higher prices. So it's no surprise that over the last few weeks, my inbox has been full of local organisations gravely concerned about this jobs tax, the £25 billion sales tax. We are shocked and they are heartbroken because Labour promised not to raise national insurance. Indeed, the then Shadow Chancellor called it a jobs tax and said they would never pursue such a thing. So who are the organisations most worried and writing to me? St Barnabas, Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire Air Ambulance. Uppingham GP practice. Stamford GP practice. And I would point out the Royal College GPs have said that it will cost £2.2 million appointments to service these increases. The Vista Royal Leicestershire Rutland Whitecliff Society for the Blind. Local nurseries. My local Citizens Advice. My care agencies and hospitality businesses. These are the people who are writing to me. And as we approach Small Business Saturday, while I have my independent shop campaign, where on average around 100,000 votes are cast, people voting for their local favourite independent businesses, those businesses are now writing to me saying how worried they are. Family businesses are particularly worried, and it will affect rural communities most of all, this tax, because they have smaller margins. They're already worried about farmers going out of business on whom they're reliant, and we have small symbiotic communities who support one another. I will happily give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making a very important point about the impact that this will have on small businesses. Now, in 2021, she voted for the Health and Social Care Levy bill. I've checked her Hansard. She mentioned none of these concerns in 2021. That was an increase of 1.25 points on national insurance, employed to employers and employees. This is a smaller rise, protecting employees. Can she say why all of a sudden she's now concerned, whereas 3 years ago she wasn't?
Give way. The gentleman may not recognise at that point we're just coming out of something called the pandemic, and it was the health and social care vote. So yes, I absolutely voted to do what we need to do at that point in time. It was a specific levy to raise specific funds for our health and social care. So I will happily stand behind that vote, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, it's interesting because this tax will make it harder for businesses to recruit. Indeed, it's going to put up 3 times the price and it will cost about £800 per employee. This is not how you get growth. It is how you lose staff as employers let people go. It is how you see increased demands on our welfare budgets. It is how you kill off your town centres. It is how you see hospices close. And it is how you see local authorities ending up reducing services. And it is how you see charities, no, I will not give way, and it is how charities end up, it will be how charities end up redirecting their Christmas appeals where people give the pennies they have spare to instead paying the Exchequer rather than supporting those who are most desperate that charities should be spending their money on. This was the largest tax grab, Madam Deputy Speaker, of Labour's budget, and it will impact women
and young people, most of all. And yet there is an absence from that side from at all about the impact on those who will be most affected. Right. Employers are the growth makers, and they are begging Labour to reverse this tax. Yeah. But working people will be those who will be worst affected. There is still time, Madam Deputy Speaker, for Labour to reverse course, to listen and recognise the ideology they are pursuing is going to harm our communities. It is time for them to think about the impact, reconsider what they are doing, particularly to our GP directors and others. I look forward to hearing from the Minister when I share with him those letters and seeing what he says to them in return. Reverse course, it's not too late, and fundamentally change your ways.
Danny Beales.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue at the crux of the debate today is one of economic responsibility, and it's a choice whether to invest or let further decline take place in our public services. They say week is a long time in politics. Well, 4 months is clearly still not long enough for the party opposite to learn any lessons from the last general election and why they might be sitting on those benches and we might be sitting on these. They crashed the economy. They wasted billions of pounds of taxpayers' hard-earned money, and they ran the NHS into the ground. Yeah. They then called an early election to run away from the mess that they knew this government was inheriting. As legislators, we need to be honest with the electorate about the trade-offs and challenges this country faces. And we cannot simultaneously rebuild our public services and cut taxes at the same time. As has been said, there is no magic money tree, and we saw with the disastrous Liz Truss mini-budget the impacts of a government that doesn't understand those facts. I will give way.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. I recognise there are political differences across the House, but he surely has to be concerned about the overall impact of the decision on national insurance to the ability and inclination of those who invest in the real economy to generate the wealth and the tax revenues that will sustain the economy going forward. Surely he can recognise that the decisions made by his government are having a negative effect on growth, which will mean more taxes and more borrowing.
Thank you for that rather long intervention, but I must say, the party opposite do not understand the economy. If you can't get a train to work, you cannot work. If you cannot get a hospital appointment, you cannot work. And time again, I hear from employers, they want investment, they want stability, they want their employees to be able to contribute in the workplace, and to separate public services and the private sector into two completely diametrically opposed parts of the economy is what your party has... Sorry, the party opposite, apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the party opposite did for 14 years. They cut public services time and time again, and we all face longer-term costs because of that fact. The Labour government understands that. Sadly, the party opposite still does not. The choice, which we're still already hearing, is for continuing austerity in this country. No one in this country voted for that, and no one on this side of the chamber at least, wants that. We want to see NHS waiting lists fall. We want to see schools which are crumbling rebuilt, and vital public services, our armed forces, invested in. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and he and I are obviously on the Health Select Committee, and so I ask him, with all seriousness and genuineness, does he not see the risk that this tax rise will have on GP surgeries, on the hospice sector, on the voluntary sector that actually supports a lot of what the NHS does?
I thank my right honourable friend for that contribution. What we have both heard on the Health Select Committee is the NHS has been left on its knees after 14 years, and all sectors of the health service are crying out for investment. I hear in my constituency from doctors and nurses who are thankful that finally they're being recognised with decent pay. The members opposite declare them trade union barons. No, they're nurses and doctors and teachers and police officers. So, as I've said, we need to invest. The Ministry of Defence homes in my constituency must be invested in. My old primary school at Deansfield, with crumbling classrooms, needs to be invested in. This party has a plan to make that happen, and it's vital, therefore, that we fund those measures which any responsible government would do. Therefore, we do have to make difficult but necessary decisions and ask the largest businesses to pay slightly more to help fund those vital public services. I do understand concerns that have been raised, but as the spokesman for the government has put forward, half of businesses will not pay the extra contributions, and some, in fact, the smallest, will pay even less. I've given way a number of times already, so I want to make some more progress, if you'll allow. And I must say, it's a bit rich for the party opposite to claim now, suddenly, to have discovered the charity sector and to be the party of the third sector. Having worked in the third sector for 10 years myself, I remember nothing but the party opposite slamming the charity sector for year after year after year. And the charities that I meet want us to fix the NHS, to fix homelessness, to fix the social and economic problems that we've inherited from the last government. And locally in Hillingdon, the Conservative Council hasn't been a champion of councils, it's cut them to the bone. Most of the charities I meet have a handful of employees, at best, left. And they're likely, under the measures of this government, to see support. Fundamentally, in this budget, we face a choice, and we have chosen to protect the most vulnerable in society. However, it appears that Conservatives opposite still fail to understand basic economics. They want all the benefits of this budget, at least they do this week, but they don't seem to know how they'll pay for them. They drove our public services into crisis, and now they oppose the very measures that we are taking to rebuild them in this budget. Nothing has changed. They are not a serious and responsible party of government. They're still addicted to endless public service cuts, paying more and getting less, constantly taking the short-term, easy approach. And it would be immensely irresponsible for any government just to ignore the crisis in our public services, to return to austerity, instability and decline. Well, we choose investment over decline. That's what my constituents voted for. More doctors, more nurses, fair pay and investment, not decline. I will.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but on the point of more doctors, how can he say that they will see more doctors when our constituents, our GP surgeries are telling us they will have to cut doctors, cut staff and cut appointments as a result of the national insurance cut? What will you say, can I ask the honourable gentleman what he would say to them as a result of that national insurance increase?
Thank you. I would say that £25 billion for the NHS, a record level of investment since the last Labour government. So I ask the opposition, what would they do? Would they prefer to let NHS waiting lists grow, inequalities rise between state and private education? Would they reverse our investment into neighbourhood policing or our increased funding for social care? If not, what taxes would they raise instead to pay for those measures? Because they can't continue to have it both ways. It's clear the opposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, haven't learnt any lessons. Their position continues to be founded upon an economic fiction. They're the same old Conservative Party that crashed our economy in 2022, and they would do it again. Well, this budget and this government will not. We choose investment, we choose our NHS, and we choose to balance our budget.
Now, with a 4-minute time limit and a reminder about interventions, members are using up the time that others could have had. Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Paul and Melissa Johnson, the directors of Home Instead, are local business owners of an adult social care provider based near Twyford in my constituency of Wokingham. They predict that the national insurance increase will be in the region of £45,000 a year, based on their current payroll, and the increase in the minimum wage and other costs will add a further £55,000 a year. So, some similar businesses may have to scale back their plans for growth at existing operations or even face the prospect of closing down. Inevitably, this will have a significant impact on their elderly clients, along with the local authorities that they work with. Nationally, it is the same story, because the government's job tax will be a tipping point for thousands of care providers. This could have been avoided if the government had instead chosen to increase taxes on big banks, online gambling companies and social media giants, all of whom need to pay their fair share of tax. The Conservatives allowed the banks and social media giants to get off the hook as far as taxes were concerned. Why are Labour doing the same thing? I would like to ask the Minister, will the government commit to exempting social care from the increase in employers' national insurance contributions? And if not, how will they protect those who are affected by the potential closures of social care providers? Concerns do not end here. I recently visited the Twyford GP surgery and spoke to their fantastic GP partners about the impact of the national insurance increase that it will have on their ability to effectively deliver primary care. Because it's the same story across the country, not just Twyford. They are looking at effectively a 4% reduction in funding, which will impact the services that they are able to offer, including services like joint injections and contraception. The Chancellor will compensate the NHS for the cost of the tax increase, but this support is not available to GPs and the vast majority of care providers who are in the private sector, leading to even greater pressures on our health and care services. When the GP-patient ratio for my area is rising, with 2,101 patients for every GP compared to England's national average of 1,664 patients per GP, this is simply unacceptable and taking place at the worst possible time because GP practices are already in crisis. Patient lists are soaring and we simply don't have enough GPs. The government must urgently provide assurances that GP practices will be given the same protection as the rest of the NHS and receive the necessary funding to cover these additional costs. It is simply common sense to protect GPs at a time of crisis, and I'm sure that millions of people across the country will agree with that.
On that point, would the gentleman give way?
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Wasn't sure for a minute there. Thank you for that reluctant acceptance. I congratulate the gentleman on his speech. Does the gentleman agree with me that, and with the light water doctor practice in my constituency, that the next rise on an average GP surgery, such as light water, equates to the salary of a full nurse, and that this next rise, whether by accident or design, is going to have a very significant impact on our constituents and their receipt of healthcare.
I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and you are 100% right. The GP surgeries also told me that they spend a disproportionate amount of time actually seeking out different funding pots, which is time and resource hungry, and it's time that could be spent on patient care. Will the Minister commit to simplifying the process of funding for GPs?
Jake Richards.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, for this new intake of youngish, and I use that description carefully, new members on this side of the House. We might be forgiven for shorter memories and other more long-suffering members, but this is not the first time a Labour Chancellor has made difficult decisions on tax to invest in the future of public services, and in particular our NHS. 22 years ago, a Labour Chancellor told this House the NHS was in need of reform and modernisation, and that investment was needed now not only to deliver better services, but to, in the inimitable style of Gordon Brown, define the character of our country. That decision to raise national insurance contributions, combined with the far-sighted reforms, delivered the shortest waiting times and highest public satisfaction with the NHS in our country's history. And now, after 14 years of Tory government, history has repeated itself. A Labour government once again fixing the mess made by the Tories. Our NHS once again facing questions over its future and quality. Indeed, those choices are more stark today. The challenge before us is not simply to improve standards and resources in the NHS, but to save the very idea itself. And back in 2002, the Tories opposed the difficult decisions on tax to support our NHS. The Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green was then the leader, and used precisely the same slogans as this leader of the opposition today. The politics of protest, not government. And a year later, he was out of his job. His own party lacked confidence in him and got rid of him. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are not able to gamble on political events, but what odds of history repeating itself here too? And when the opposition crow about the budget, what is their alternative? Do they oppose the £25 billion investment in our NHS? From which magic money tree will they fund their ever-spiralling spending commitments? Fixing our public finances without compromising our belief in a strong NHS is at the heart of this government's agenda. And it's so important because I've had countless conversations with constituents who face agonising waits for years for basic operations, or those who dread the 8 a.m. rush to call to book an appointment at the local GP, knowing full well that they will often be disappointed. They know the NHS needs this urgent investment, but they also know the NHS must change. And that's why this investment by this government has been said to be a down payment on reform. We must transform the way in which our NHS operates, or this investment will be wasted. The NHS serves a wholly different population in a wholly different context than when the Labour Party created it in 1947. We are living longer. Our health issues are more structural. Technology can transform our interactions with healthcare provision, and patients can feel more empowered again, but we need to get that funding into NHS now. The Tories want all the benefits of this investment, but they've got no idea how they would pay for it. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we can look to history again to tell us what happens when Conservatives make promises without a clue of how they would fund them. Look at the 40 hospitals that haven't been built. Look at the £6 billion black hole in our asylum system. Look at the mini-budget. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank the gentleman for giving way. The honourable gentleman rightly points out the need to invest in the NHS. I wonder if he also recognises that by imposing NIC on primary health care providers like Wellmar Hospice Care in West Dorset that provides vital end-of-life care to residents has to raise £26,000 a day to fund its service, it will result...
Perfectly long enough. Jake Richards.
Great, I welcome that intervention. This point has been made over and over again in interventions, and the Health Secretary has been very clear. The Health Secretary has been very clear that funding allocations for primary care services and other services will be set out in due course, and there will be more money to do it as a result of this Labour government than there would have been. This debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, shows the opposition to be mere opportunists, not capable or indeed perhaps unwilling to face up to the difficult decisions that we face as a country. We've seen what path that takes us down. We cannot do that again. Thank you.
Julia Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor's budget has created a right mess, and no matter how regularly the Prime Minister bleats that he's fixing the foundations, it's a mess of Labour's own making. Date stamped 30th of October 2024. The OBR has forensically dismantled their pathetic fallacy of the £22 billion black hole. But even if they hadn't, my constituents aren't stupid. If the Chancellor was as worried by the state of the public finances as she said she was, why would she then increase borrowing by £32 billion more annually, undermining our financial resilience? Why would she make choices to splurge cash on union pay rises for no productivity commitments? Why would she make a series of decisions that would lead the OBR to downgrade their growth forecasts since our April budget? I shall.
I welcome the extra pay for our teachers and our doctors, and even if she doesn't think that our public sector heroes deserve that pay rise, would she accept that we had lost school days costing the economy £900 million and the NHS had to spend £9.3 billion on temporary staffing?
I was interested by the train drivers' pay deal, where they actually went back to the deal that we had made and undid the productivity commitments that we put in there. Why would she front-load spending on the NHS before the Health Secretary has even got a plan on how he would use that precious cash, therefore risking billions being wasted? It makes no sense, and everyone outside this place and all inside it, apart from the Labour members who are gleefully wafting their order papers around, can see that. She's asking for an extra £40 billion in taxes from the British people, and it's largely been taken from some of the most productive, entrepreneurial people in the country, the people who provide jobs and who do the right thing. And I worry very deeply that their good money is going to be poured into the public sector and benefits without any noticeable improvement in public services. And when that happens, the Chancellor's going to be coming back for more. And the incentive for anyone in this country to be entrepreneurial, to stick their neck out, to take the risk of employing people, to build true wealth for this nation will diminish.
and then we're going to find ourselves in a downward spiral, ever more unable to withstand external shocks and ever less appealing as a country in which our young people are going to want to stay to create and innovate and build. Now, as we know, a big chunk of that £40 billion is coming from the sneaky rise in employer national insurance, something the government obscured from their plans in July. But let's start with the pain that the Chancellor's choice on NI is causing her own cabinet colleagues, for she's now blown holes in the budgets of every major government department. The Health Secretary's now got problems with GPs, with pharmacies, social care, hospices. The Deputy Prime Minister, no, I'm afraid there's not enough time. The Deputy Prime Minister has got councils telling her that they have to find over £1 billion extra to pay providers for their services. The Culture Secretary has got charities and tourism businesses and cultural venues all telling her they've got major problems. Yes. The Education Secretary, she's had to raise tuition fees by £400 million because universities are telling her that they've now got a hole in their budget of exactly the same size. And it goes on. But I want to talk about the pain it's causing to my constituents, because the lowering of the NI threshold in particular, which is whacking the kind of businesses that employ a lot of young, lower-wage workers, parents getting back into the workplace, or people who are picking up extra jobs to make ends meet. So let me give you some examples. First, a local after-school club provider employing 34 people and offering wraparound clubs that help out hundreds of favouring families, the kind of clubs that make that work-family juggle survivable. Because of the NICS hike and the lowering of the threshold, their bill is going to rise annually from £10,851 to £26,040. Now, the last thing they want to do is to lose staff or hike fees on local families, but they can't see a way around that. An outdoor activities business gives young people across London the most amazing opportunities. Their costs next year are going to increase by £70,000 as a direct result of this budget. They now worry that they won't be able to fund their young people's bursary that's currently providing over 1,300 disadvantaged kids in the region outdoor experiences. Third, a home care business that looks after older people in Havering. Their branch in Hornchurch faces paying an extra £100,000 a year, making it loss-making from April. No, I'm afraid there is simply not enough time. This is absolutely crazy. And finally, I want to mention a small private school in my constituency. Their pupils are some of the most vulnerable and deprived in our capital, as it's an alternative provision school. First, Labour hits them with VAT. Now they're going to be hitting them with NICS and wage increases. Now, either they absorb that cost or it's going to be passed on to the local council. So those are 4 businesses from Harold Hill to Hornchurch providing critical services to my constituents, employing young people, giving working families opportunities. And now they're going to be hit by tens of thousands of extra costs. And that's before I even talk about the GPs, the pharmacists, the dentists, the charities, the shops, the restaurants, the pubs. And it's for them that I'm going to wholeheartedly vote for this opposition motion.
Which brings us to the front bench contributions. James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be closing this debate on behalf of His Majesty's loyal opposition. I recognise a lot of members haven't been able to speak because of the level of concern in the earlier debate about Labour's family farm tax. But in the contributions, we have heard talk of difficult decisions. But members opposite seem to be in denial about what the real-world impacts of those decisions will be for the organisations who have to make difficult decisions in their constituencies about wages or jobs. Today they have an opportunity to stand with their constituents. And this debate is fundamentally about trust and the promises made by the Labour Party. At the election, Labour's manifesto promised they wouldn't increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase taxes on national insurance. It was clear to everyone what that meant. The IFS said that this would be a straightforward breach of their manifesto. And Labour then chose to break their promise, introducing this £25 billion a year jobs tax. And once again, we've heard the tired claims blaming a fancy £22 billion black hole, claims debunked by the independent OBR, as well as by my humble friend for Hornchurch and Upminster, who pointed out it's the government's £1 billion pay deals for their union trade masters which created a lot of that hole. Voters aren't fooled. They know what Labour said and did. They broke their promise to the British people. And what has been the impact of this £25 billion job tax? Well, business confidence is plummeting. Output has already reduced for the first time in over a year. The Chief Secretary and members opposite again claimed the impact of this measure is limited. But even in the very limited impact assessment he referred to, HMRC estimates that 940,000 businesses will lose out in net terms, with an average annual tax increase of £800 per employee. The average employer losing out will see their liabilities increase by £26,000 a year. And it's working people who pay the price with lower wages, higher prices and fewer jobs. Many honourable members across the House have spoken about the impact on charities and organisations in their constituency. My thrill-seeking honourable friend for Hamble Valley, who I'm glad is in one piece, spoke about the hit that will come to hospices who provide vital care and the higher costs that they will see of tens of millions of pounds. Charities will face a £1.4 billion higher bill. Marie Curie alone will have a £3 million hit to their costs. The Royal College of General Practitioners have warned the extra costs could see surgeries forced to make redundancies or to close altogether, and adult social care providers will see a £2.8 billion hit in the next financial year. Yet, despite the warnings from hospices, care homes, dentists, nurseries, pharmacies and others, there's been cold comfort from the Minister. No clarity on whether support will be provided, no clarity on when support might come, how much it might be, if it will come. As my honourable friend for Rutland and Stamford said, given these impacts on these groups, the government should rethink these proposals. And while 800 jobs a day were created under Conservatives from 2010, Labour's jobs tax is expected to see jobs lost and fewer jobs created. Bloomberg estimates that as many as 130,000 jobs could be lost. But perhaps most concerning is the impact on the lowest paid. The OBR estimates 80% of the cost of these measures will be paid for by reducing wages. And reducing the level at which employer NICs is levied from £9,100 to £5,000 a year will particularly hurt part-time, female and younger workers. The OBR expects this measure to raise £17.7 billion a year on average. No wonder the CBI have warned that two-thirds of their members are reducing their plans to take people on, and the British Retail Consortium has warned of a £2.3 billion hit that means job losses are inevitable. And of course, this tax will also push up inflation. Tesco, Lidl, all the major retailers have said so. A more expensive weekly shop, that's the price of this measure. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard today about the need for investment in public services, which we all agree with on these benches, and I'm happy to highlight our record investment into the NHS, climbing up the International Education League tables, progress that's under threat from the measures that the party opposite wants put in, and we would have made different choices to this tax-rising budget. Our plans would have grown the economy faster. The OBR downgraded growth after this budget. Our plans would have delivered £12 billion of welfare savings. Plans put in the deep freeze by the party opposite. And our plans would have improved productivity in the public sector. Getting back to pre-COVID levels would save £20 billion a year. Madam Deputy Speaker, they asked for ideas. There are the ideas. Madam Deputy Speaker, 4 million jobs were created under Conservative government since 2010. Youth unemployment cut by 40%. 1 million more disabled people into work. The fastest growing economy in the G7. In contrast, Labour are breaking promises made only a few months ago, choosing to put up taxes despite the damage to the economy and to working people. And the Chancellor's pledge not to raise further taxes has dropped like a stone. We've seen this movie. They'll be back for more. I urge honourable members to support our motion.
Minister James Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I begin by thanking all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions during the course of the debate. This government was elected with an immediate and critical need to draw a line under the fiscal irresponsibility and economic management of the Conservatives. Since day one in office, we have been determined to deliver economic stability, and we have done so by fixing the public finances, introducing tough new fiscal rules, and getting the NHS and other public services back on their feet. It is on those foundations that we will boost investment and drive long-term economic growth to make people better off. This is not an easy task, as the Chancellor has said, but fixing these foundations is what underpins all of the difficult but necessary decisions we have taken. It is that goal of fixing the foundations of our public finances and the NHS that has driven our decision to make the changes to employers' national insurance that we have been discussing today. Madam Deputy Speaker, in taking the difficult decisions at budget, the Chancellor has been determined to protect working people, and that is why our budget made no changes to income tax, the rate of VAT or the amount of national insurance that working people pay. As a result of our budget, people will not see a penny more on their pay slips. But a £22 billion black hole in the public finances cannot be fixed without having to take any difficult decisions at all. The Conservatives in government had hid their heads in the sand and ignored their fiscal reality. Now, both they and other parties opposite are desperate to have it both ways. They say they support extra money for the NHS, but they refuse to back the measures to fund it. Madam Deputy, I've been very generous over the last 48 hours in giving way in this place, so I've got very limited time. Although I would like to hear more about the plane that he spoke about earlier. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have made tough but necessary choices that this set of circumstances require, and that is why we have decided to raise employers' national insurance. Now, these changes broadly return national insurance revenues as a proportion of GDP to the level they were before the previous government's cuts to employee and self-employed NICs, but they do so in a way that does not result in higher taxes on people's payslips. They also do so in a way that increases protection for small businesses and charities, because we have decided to more than double the employment allowance to £10,500 and remove the business size threshold. That means that from April 2025, all eligible organisations will be able to employ up to 4 people on the national living wage without paying a penny of employers' national insurance. Over half of all employers will pay the same or less national insurance than they did before. But we acknowledge that for other employers, this decision will have an impact, and employers will have a choice about how they respond to changes, and some of these choices will be hard. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't have enough time to respond to all of the points directly, but I will briefly respond to, I was going to say, the member for Beverley Holderness. He has been intervening all afternoon, but now he is not here. He asked about table 3.2 in the OBR report, and I wanted to respond to his questions about that. I'm sorry to disappoint. It's nowhere near as interesting as I think he suspects it might be. It was simply published in error, and it has now been corrected, because the government provides support for departments and other public sector employees with the additional employer national insurance contributions liabilities, and separately we have provided an additional 3.2% increase to local government spending power, including £600 million of new grant funding for social care. I'd like to also thank all the other honourable members for their contributions today from Makerfield, Stevenage, North East Derbyshire, Uxbridge and South Ruislip, Rother Valley, Hamble Valley, Hazel, Rutland and Stamford, Wokingham and Hornchurch and Upminster. Might I briefly as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, respond to the point of order that was made earlier by the member for South Shropshire, because I welcome the chance to repeat the fact that the OBR said in October that their March forecast would have been materially different had it known what the previous government did not share with them at the time of the March forecast. I am confident that the Hansel record is correct, which specifically includes materially different in quotations and not the rest of my statement. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am grateful to have had the chance to respond on behalf of the government to the questions that have been raised today. The decision to make changes to employer national insurance was not taken lightly. It was a tough decision for us to take. I recognise that whilst half of businesses and organisations will pay the same or less than before, others will face difficult decisions of their own. We have asked employers to make a greater contribution, and while we do not expect those affected to welcome this, I hope the majority will understand why we have done this. Because the simple fact of this matter is that our country needed a government prepared to fix the public finances, get public services back on their feet and restore economic stability. It is only through an ambitious and fiscally responsible approach that we can boost investment and growth, laying the path toward the brighter days ahead. The previous government had completely lost sight of that. Madam Deputy Speaker, my office in the Treasury building used to be that of Nigel Lawson. He once said, and I quote, "To govern is to choose. To appear to be unable to choose is to appear to be unable to govern." That very neatly reflects where the party opposite have ended up now. Because before the government, the Conservatives had given up on effective governing, and since then they have given up on effective opposition. Because what this vote today really comes down to, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a choice between irresponsibility on the opposition benches and a government prepared to do what is needed to build a better future. It is this Labour Party in government that is taking the tough but necessary decisions with a once-in-a-generation budget to wipe the slate clean and put our country on a better path. It is this government that has restored economic stability, fixed the public finances and hardwired fiscal responsibility into the budget-making process. It is this government that is putting the NHS back on its feet, raising the national living wage and protecting people's payslips. And it is this government that will invest in our country, create wealth in every nation and region and make people across Britain better off. That is the choice today, and that is why we are rejecting the opposition's motion.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division, clear the lobby. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The tellers for the ayes are Nick Timothy and David Simmons. The tellers for the noes are Kate Dearden and Martin McCluskey. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 165. The noes to the left, 334.
The ayes were 165 and the noes were 334. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock.